Hi class, in this video I'm going to talk about drafting and revising, but I wanted to start with this image of the writing process just to remind you that the writing process is not really linear and we can move back and forth between any of these stages at any time. So maybe as we're drafting and revising, you might discover that you need to do more research, you might discover that you need to go back to the drawing board. That's all okay and part of the writing process. Right, but for our purposes today, I'm going to again be talking about moving from that research stage to actually drafting and writing your essay. Of course, you've probably already been doing some writing as we go along, like taking notes on the sources that you found. You wrote an annotated bibliography, so you're already starting to think through your ideas. But now we're going to kind of take that next step and think about ways that we can put the whole essay, put everything together, right? So to get there, it's important to kind of take a minute now to think about where you're at in the development of your ideas. Has the story of your research reached any kind of climax? What do you think about your topic now? What new questions do you have? And what conclusions, if any, can you draw about this whatever the topic that you have been learning about, reading about? Have you reached a point where you can draw any conclusions? All right, so you can just like think about your answers to those questions. Alternatively, our textbook author Bruce Ballinger has what I think is a really productive way to kind of check in on where you're at in the research process, or like the development of your ideas about your topic, like that process. Um, so what he suggests doing is on a piece of notebook paper, on one side of the page, you write down questions from a fictional reader. He's named the reader Dave, but you could call him anything if you want. Maybe you know a Dave and you don't want to call him Dave, or maybe you want to answer Dave's questions. Anyways, the idea is that you, on one side of the paper, think about your topic from a reader's perspective. What questions would they have? Maybe the first question is, what's the big deal about this anyway? Like, that question asks, what is your topic and why is it important, right? Why should I listen to you talk or write about this topic? And maybe the next question they ask is like, what do you mean by that? Or can you give me an example? Did that surprise you? So you can kind of let those questions come to you organically. It's like, what kind of questions would a reader have? And then on the other side of the paper, he suggests answering the questions. What doing this will do for you is help you kind of, it helps with a few things. One is that it's going to help you kind of synthesize information from your research. So, to synthesize means to combine. So you're going to be combining what you've learned from your research with your own voice or your own ideas by kind of working through writing this way. So that synthesis it's going to help you with synthesis. It should also kind of help you start to think about, again, where you're at with that idea of like, have you reached any conclusion? Can you draw a conclusion from your research? Is there one main idea that's really interesting to you that you think would also be interesting to readers? So this is kind of a fun way to kind of get you moving through those stages rather than just sitting there staring at a blank piece of paper. Right, so I'm going to strongly encourage you to pause the video, pull out a piece of paper or open a Word document and practice the activity. Write Dave's questions on one side of the paper and on the other side write your answers. I would suggest spending about 30 minutes thinking through your ideas like this. And of course, some of the content that you write on your answer side of the page might become actual content in your essay. So you don't just think of it like you're just going to throw this away at the end. Again, the purpose is to help you start thinking through ideas and start synthesizing the research that you have done with your own voice and your own thoughts, so that we can hear what you think based on what you have learned or what you have read about. So when you finish, you want to try to answer this one final question. Based on everything that you have learned, what's your point? And if this activity is too contrived for you, you could instead write that question based on everything you learned, what's your point, at the top of a piece of paper, and just do some free writing for, about, I would say, 20 to 30 minutes, kind of just getting your voice on the page without worrying about organization or structure or any of those things. Just again, so that you can start to synthesize the ideas of others with your own voice and into your own thinking. All right, so at this point in your student careers, you've probably written enough essays and taken enough English classes to know that any essay that we write needs an organizing idea. It's also called a thesis or a main idea. Our textbook author, Bruce Ballinger, calls it the Say One Freaking Thing rule, or SOFT. Again, I think of it as an organizing idea because it's a main overarching idea that will encompass all of the other things you discuss in the paper, like your subpoints or related concepts or things like that. But we need an overarching idea that can organize or bring everything together. Depending on where you're at in your thinking process, it might take the form of a thesis, or it might take the form of a research question, kind of exploring the answers. So, right, so if you reflect on your free writing or your research check-in with Dave, and you found that you had a strong point you want to make, there's a clear, strong point in your mind about your topic, about what needs to be done based on the research, then you're probably going to follow an argumentative structure in your writing. If, however, you kind of reflect on what you've learned and you still don't quite know what the answer is, this happens a lot in research, we still don't quite know, then maybe the form that your writing should take is what we call narrative logic, or more of an exploratory essay, where your organizing idea will be a question rather than a claim reasons structure. Right, and then if you have now been kind of sitting there thinking about your ideas and you still don't know what you want to say, that indicates that you probably need to go back in the writing process and do some more research or spend some more time learning about your topic until you get to a point where you know what you want to say. All right, so let's say you feel like you've learned a lot about your topic and you have some ideas of what you want to say. One approach that you might take to structuring your paper would be, again, what we call narrative logic. This implies that you're going to kind of tell the story of your research, or, yeah, kind of maybe tell the story of development of knowledge on the topic. Right, so we use this, or what it looks like is kind of what we would call coordinating ideas together, finding similar ideas, finding or finding similarities and differences among ideas or perspectives on a topic. And we place those ideas in context, or in stories, so that we can understand under what context the information applies or is meaningful. So you might want to use narrative logic if your main motive at this point is still to find out what you think about your topic. So maybe you focused on hourly rounding, and there are both positives and negatives to that practice in the field of nursing, and so you still want to find out what you think about the topic. If you want to tell the story of what you've come to understand about your research question, a narrative approach is a good one. If you were writing about a problem in a particular time or place, maybe your Research at this point has become like highly specific to like a real workplace that you were in, then a narrative approach can be a good one. If you're interested in exploring causes and effects or reasons and consequences, like if your research is kind of focusing on like this is a cause of a problem, here are the effects, here are the solutions. Again, narrative structure might work well. So what does a narrative essay like logic look like? Our writer Ballinger breaks it up into 3 acts, kind of like the acts of a play, right? So in Act 1, we would seek to dramatize the question or problem by like indicating what's at stake, why people should care, and we might answer that like why people should care question by sharing a story that indicates the significance of our topic, right? And then you establish your purpose or motive for the research. So you explain to readers what you want to learn and why. Then in Act 2, the body of the paper, you're going to do things like provide background information for understanding the question. You might present relevant exhibits for analysis, significant findings, or key arguments. And then we flag, also we use this time to kind of flag where your thinking has changed. So maybe you point out to readers that at the start of your research process, you weren't really on board with the topic, or you disagreed with the like strategy that a lot of researchers are talking about, and then you might, maybe something changed your mind, and so you would tell readers like, I felt this way until I encountered this piece of evidence and that changed my mind. So you kind of key readers in to those kind of changes in your thinking or narrate your thinking process, right? And then in Act 3, the conclusion of your paper, we would do things like return to the research question, explain what you know now that you didn't know when you started, and then we also reflect on what's still unclear about the research topic or questions that remain unanswered. All right, alternatively, you might want to structure your essay in more of an argumentative format. This is probably what you're more familiar with in terms of structuring a paper. So that format would imply, we make an overarching argumentative claim or thesis, then we support it with reasons, and then below our reasons we provide evidence. So this structure kind of subordinates ideas with like a big idea, smaller ideas, evidence underneath. This can be, this should be appropriate if you think that you have a point that you want to prove. If you've done all your research and you are drawn to a specific conclusion, perspective, or like you have an argument that you can articulate, that you see as compelling, that you think you have significant evidence for, and you want to persuade readers to that perspective. So Ballinger describes the argument structure in a like beginning, middle, end format, where the beginning should kind of encompass the whole, the entirety of the essay. It should tell us why the topic matters by dramatizing your problem or question, tell us what's at stake, and then it should kind of slowly narrow its focus toward the thesis statement, which should encompass the rest of the essay. Our thesis statement should provide both an opinion statement and a summary of your reasoning to support that statement. Then in the middle of the paper, you're going to break down that summary of reasoning into specific points that support your thesis statement. So we're like building the case for our thesis. And then below those points, we provide background information, explain terms, provide evidence. We consider counter arguments. We might qualify our argument to say, like, I understand it's not true in this setting, but it is true here in my particular circumstance, or like I understand what people are saying, but this fact should, the fact that it's going to save us money should mean that like we should adopt this strategy anyway, right? And then in the end of the essay, I revisit my thesis. I might also explain how it has been expanded, qualified, or confirmed by my research. I also want to think about what questions still remain, and then I might be more action focused in terms of like what should be done based on the argument that I have made. Okay, regardless of what structure you choose to use for your essay, there are a number of ways in or ways of getting started. And this is what we're going to focus on in our discussion post for this week, is kind of experimenting with ways into the essay. So Ballinger gives us a number of ways that we might begin an essay, right? We could start with an anecdote. The anecdote is a story that kind of frames what your research focus was, kind of might indicate the significance of the topic by sharing a short story. Alternatively, you might begin in a scene. So let's say your research topic is about management practices. You could begin with a scene describing a new type of management practice, like what it would look like, and then transition to the specific research focus of your paper. You can begin with a profile, talking about maybe a specific person that was important in your research, what they've contributed, or how they lead you to a question. We can start with background information. That's probably a more familiar way of starting. We start with kind of the big idea and narrow our focus by providing more details until we get to our question. Sometimes it's interesting to start with an interesting quotation. Maybe somebody said something really in an eloquent way in your research, in a provocative way, in a way that kind of sticks with you or shaped the focus of the rest of your project. Providing us with that quotation can be a good way to start. We might start in dialogue between people involved in your topic. So for example, Ballinger says someone's paper on the connection between spouse abuse and alcoholism began with a conversation between himself and a woman who had been abused by her husband. So we can put ourselves in conversation with somebody like a research source, or we can describe a conversation we've had in real life in relation to our topic. We can start with a big question, right? We can assert the question at the beginning and then kind of provide more information about how we arrived at that question. We can start an essay by pointing out a contrast or a contradiction. So maybe your research kind of led you to two different like solutions that people are taking in the business world or in your organization toward a problem. You might describe the contrast between those two different solutions. Or, yeah, we want to focus on like, then the rest of your essay would compare and contrast those two different things. So we might begin there. And then another way that we can start our essay is simply by kind of announcing our focus. Which means our first sentence would simply state our topic, and then we would provide background information and end with our thesis statement. That can be a particularly good way to start a paper if your topic is really complex. You may be served by simply stating it rather than having readers kind of guess or wonder at what your focus is going to be. Right, so since I'm in education, I thought I might want to research the trend of problem-based learning. And to kind of get started moving from research to writing, I'm going to try out a few different approaches for an introduction to my paper. This first one I wanted to play with was that idea of starting your paper with an anecdote or a short story. So here's my attempt at that. I said, we're playing a game I like to call Murder, She Wrote. I give my students a cartoon image of a murder scene and ask them to work in groups to construct a narrative of what happened, complete with supporting evidence or details visible in the image. The point is to illustrate the need for evidence when making an argument. It's always lively, but in this class, the activity had taken on a life of its own. The students had independently begun drafting arguments and preparing formal presentations to share with the class. This made me reflect on the trend of problem-based learning, where students are given carefully crafted guiding questions, and then in theory, learning takes many shapes and is student-directed. Maybe there is something to the idea of problem-based learning. If it can generate the same excitement that my silly game did, it may be worth trying. So I'm using my story to kind of grab attention and focus toward a specific research focus, in this case, which is going to be learning about problem-based learning and what are the benefits, and then considering whether it's worth adopting in my own classroom or making a recommendation for my colleagues to adopt in their classrooms. Alternatively, I thought about starting this paper with a question, which is how I started my final thesis in graduate school. I had a really interesting question that had inspired my research, and so I started by sharing that question. So here I did something similar. I said, in Composition Quarterly, Nancy Miller asked, how can we best help students become the writers we want them to be? As a writing teacher, this is a question I reflect on often as I prepare lessons or consider what went well in class. The question becomes even more pertinent when trying to make sense of potentially faddish trends in educational theory, like gamification, grading contrast, no homework, new themes, or problem-based learning. In this paper, I'd like to learn more about the applications of problem-based learning in writing classrooms, as well as the benefits and drawbacks of this non-traditional approach to teaching. So again, in this case, it's both a quotation and a question, but it's kind of the question that drives me or inspires my research, and so I thought I could start my paper by sharing that with my readers, so then they kind of have insight into what my motive is and how I'm going to be thinking about the information that I found in order to make a recommendation for or against problem-based learning. Right, and here's the last strategy that I thought I would try out. In this case, it's a little bit of a scene setting, but it's primarily, my goal is to focus on contrast. A contrast in two different teaching styles that I'm going to evaluate through my research in order to make a recommendation. Right, so I said, in the classroom, I observed students were spread out, sitting on the floor with laptops, others grouped around a desk in conversation, others drawing diagrams on a whiteboard. They all had the same guiding question in front of them, but were approaching it in different ways that fit their learning styles and personalities. This teaching style is called problem-based learning and contrasts sharply with traditional lecture classrooms, where the teacher identifies what information is to be learned and shares it with the class via oral explanation. In both cases, the teachers can't really control what the students learn. In a lecture class, students might not be paying attention, for example. But I'm curious which approach is most likely to produce relevant learning for most students. So again, I've looked at, here are two different approaches to the problem of how to teach students. They contrast pretty significantly, and I want to understand which one is the best or more effective so that I can make a recommendation for myself and my colleagues. So which introduction of mine did you like best? It might depend a little bit on our own preference. It might depend on where I want to go in the rest of the paper, to think about what fits best with the rest of my ideas. I might ultimately decide to combine one or two of those introductions, but now I've got at least 3 really good options for getting started, that are interesting or could be a good foundation for my paper. So now I'm going to kind of turn this over to you. The task for our discussion board this week is to write 3 different introductions to share on the discussion board for feedback, so that you can think about what will engage readers and establish a strong foundation for your essay. As you write any of these strategies, keep in mind what you want to do, whether you're trying to assert a thesis or explore a question, as well as the assignment goal of providing a recommendation based on your research. And that recommendation might be very specific, like we should take this action or we shouldn't. Or it might be more general, like we need to do more research or we don't know enough about the topic yet. Some of those strategies you might use to find your way in are sharing an anecdote, describing a scene related to your topic, profiling a person, providing background information, starting with an interesting quotation, sharing dialogue between you and someone else on your topic, starting with a bold question, describing a contrast, or just kind of announcing your focus. I look forward to seeing what you come up with.